The largest concrete dome on the planet was not built in the 20th century or even the 19th. It was poured almost 2,000 years ago in the center of Rome without rebar, without steel frames, without computer calculations. It still stands today, and no modern engineer can clearly explain why it hasn't collapsed in all this time. Today we will go through 7 points on the map where ancient builders created things that, by all laws of physics and common sense, should not have existed in their era. Each of these objects raises the same uncomfortable question. What exactly did our ancestors know that we do not? Let's start with that very dome. The Pantheon in Rome was built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian around 125 AD. Its dome has a diameter of 43 meters and 300 millimeters, and it is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. For comparison, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, erected 1,500 years later, is smaller and yet reinforced with chains to prevent it from splitting. The Romans did without chains because they used a technique that modern engineers only arrived at in the 20th century. The concrete in the lower part of the dome is mixed with heavy tuff and travertine, and closer to the top, the builders switched to pumice, a volcanic stone that weighs 3 times less than ordinary stone. The dome becomes lighter as it rises, and this distribution of mass is not accidental, but a precise engineering calculation. At the top yawns an oculus, a circular opening almost 9 meters in diameter, open to the sky. When it rains, water enters but does not accumulate, because the Pantheon's floor has a barely noticeable slope towards the 2 hidden drain holes. The building works as a single mechanism, where every detail solves its own task. In 2023, a group of engineers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology analyzed Roman concrete and discovered lime particles in it that were previously considered a mixing defect. It turned out that these particles, upon contact with water, initiate a chemical reaction that fills microcracks. The Pantheon's concrete can repair itself, and the Romans intentionally incorporated this ability into the recipe. We discovered this mechanism only with the help of an electron microscope, and they used it 2,000 years ago. Renaissance architects came here with ropes and plumb bobs trying to unravel the secret. Filippo Brunelleschi spent several years in the Pantheon before daring to build the dome of the Florence Cathedral and still made it smaller. Michelangelo, looking at the Pantheon, said that it was more the work of angels than of men. If you are already surprised that the Romans were half a millennium ahead of future engineers, here is what is even more amazing. 1,000 years before Rome, on the island of Crete, there existed a civilization with plumbing, sewage, and a ventilation system. The Palace of Knossos was excavated in 1900 by British archaeologist Arthur Evans. He expected to find the ruins of a primitive fortress, but instead discovered a complex covering more than 20,000 square meters with 1,300 rooms. Beneath the palace floors ran an extensive network of ceramic pipes that supplied clean water from mountain springs and simultaneously drained wastewater. The pipes were conical, narrowing towards one end and fitting into each other, creating pressure in the system. This is a principle that was only formalized in hydraulics in the 19th century. The Minoans used it 1,500 years before the Romans began building their famous aqueducts. When Evans first saw this system, he refused to believe that it dated back to the 2nd millennium BC. He wrote in his diary that he was looking at engineering worthy of Victorian England, hidden beneath the ruins of the Bronze Age. In the western wing of the palace, Evans found a room he called the Queen's Chamber, with something resembling a toilet with a flushing mechanism. Water came from above, washed waste into a stone trough, which then went into an underground collector. Europe returned to this level of sanitation only in the 19th century, after a cholera epidemic. But the palace is striking not only for its engineering, but for the sheer scale of its thought. Light wells for ventilation, multi-level staircases, halls with columns narrowing towards the bottom, which creates an optical illusion of greater space. Why do you think a civilization capable of such things completely disappeared from history for 3,000 years? Write your opinion in the comments because historians still have no single answer. If the Minoans were ahead of their time with their engineering, then the next object was ahead of its time with aesthetics. The mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of the Nile looks as if it was designed in the 1930s. 3 terraces carved into the sheer rock face, connected by ramps with colonnades of strict rectangular columns without a single curl. No other Egyptian temple looks like this, because the architect Senenmut created something fundamentally new. He didn't just place the building next to the rock, he made the rock part of the building. The geometry of the temple perfectly repeats the lines of the mountain range behind it, as if the architecture grows out of the very earth. This technique, the integration of a building into the landscape, became the main idea of 20th century architectural modernism. Frank Lloyd Wright became famous for this approach when he built Falling Water in 1935, but Senenmut applied the same principle 3,500 years before him. The temple is oriented so that on the day of the winter solstice, a ray of sun penetrates through all 3 levels and illuminates the statue of the god Amun in the furthest sanctuary. This means that the builders calculated the angle of inclination of the building's axis with astronomical precision, without telescopes and without computers. Hatshepsut herself was one of the few female pharaohs. Her stepson Thutmose III, after her death, ordered the destruction of all mention of her. Workers chipped her name from stelae and erased her face from reliefs, but the temple itself was not touched because destroying it would mean destroying the rock. The building, conceived as a monument to one woman, survived all attempts to erase her from history and stood for 3.5 millennia. If it seems difficult to you to carve a building into a mountain, then the next masters went even further. They carved an entire city out of a vertical rock face starting from the top. Petra, in modern-day Jordan, was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom and the largest trading hub of the ancient world. The most famous facade, Al-Khazne, is carved from solid pink sandstone and rises 40 meters high. To understand the complexity of this work, one must understand the method. The builders started from the top of the rock and moved downwards. An error on the upper tier would mean that the entire structure would have to be abandoned because stone cannot be added back. They did not have scaffolding in the usual sense. They carved steps directly into the rock and descended them, creating the facade centimeter by centimeter. The columns of Al-Khazne are made in the Corinthian style, with detailing that is difficult to replicate even with modern milling machines. The Nabateans did not just copy Greek architecture, they mixed it with Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs, creating a style that exists nowhere else in the world. The city had more than 800 tombs, temples, and dwellings carved into the rock, and less than 15% of the territory has been excavated so far. If you are new to this channel, subscribe so you don't miss the moment when archaeologists discover the remaining 85% of Petra and what is hidden inside them. The Nabateans carved stone from top to bottom, but their hydro-engineering deserves a separate discussion. In a desert where it rains a few times a year, they built a city for 100,000 inhabitants with fountains and swimming pools. A system of canals, cisterns, and ceramic pipes collected every drop of water over hundreds of square kilometers and directed it to the city. The Nabateans found a way to coat the inner surface of stone reservoirs with waterproof plaster, the recipe for which has not yet been fully restored. When Rome annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD, Roman engineers, who considered themselves the best in the world, were amazed by the level of Nabatean water supply. They did not rebuild it, they simply continued to use it, which in itself is the highest form of professional recognition. Now let's move to the other side of the world, to Rajasthan, India, where in the 9th century a structure was built that takes the breath away of modern architects. The Chand Bari stepwell descends 13 stories and contains 3,500 steps, arranged in a perfectly symmetrical geometric pattern. Viewed from above, the walls of the well look like an optical illusion, like a render from a 3D modeling program, and not a 9th century stone masonry. Each of the four walls descends to the water via zigzagging staircases, and each step is fitted to the next with a precision that rules out accident. The well was built on the order of Raja Chand of the Nikumba dynasty, sometime between 800 and 900 AD. The official version is simple. The arid climate required deep access to groundwater. But if the only goal was water, why such insane complexity? A simple shaft with a rope and bucket would have sufficed, but here are 3,500 steps laid with mathematical precision. Some historians believe that Chand Bowery was not just a well, but a temple complex, a place of meditation where the descent to the water symbolized the path to enlightenment. The temperature at the bottom of the well is 5 to 6 degrees Celsius lower than on the surface, and in hot Rajasthan, it was a natural air conditioner. People descended not only for water, but also for coolness, which turned the well into a center of public life. On one side of the well, unlike the other three, there are no staircases. Instead, a gallery with niches, pavilions, and sculptures was built. There was a temple dedicated to the goddess of joy, Harshat Mata, and this confirms that Chand Bowery was conceived from the very beginning as something more than a source of water. The architect designed a space in which the daily necessity of descending for water became a ritual and a utilitarian structure became a work of art. What surprises engineers is the stability of the structure. 13 stories in soft limestone without a single crack for 1,200 years. What architectural object in your country or city seems inexplicably complex for its time? From India, we move to Lebanon, where lie stones that should not have been where they are. Baalbek, also known as Heliopolis, an ancient city in the Bka Valley, holds something that even modern heavy machinery cannot overcome. The Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek stands on a platform of stone blocks, 3 of which are known as the Trilithon. Each block of the Trilithon weighs about 800 tons and is approximately 21 meters long. They are raised to a height of 7 meters and laid on top of each other with millimeter precision, without mortar, without gaps. To understand the scale, 800 tons is roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded Boeing 747 passenger jets. Modern cranes capable of lifting such weight exist, but they are few and require months of site preparation. In the quarry near Baalbek, another block, the so-called Stone of the South, weighing about 1,200 tons, still lies. It was started to be cut from the rock, but was abandoned for an unknown reason. In 2014, the German Archaeological Institute discovered another block nearby, named the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing about 1,650 tons. This is the heaviest worked stone ever found on the planet, and it lies in the quarry as if it was put aside for later and never returned for. Official science suggests that the blocks were moved on wooden rollers with the help of 1,000 workers. But calculations show that to move an 800-ton block on a flat surface requires a force that can be provided by at least 40,000 people pulling simultaneously. The problem is that there is simply no room around the stone for 40,000 people and their ropes. French archaeologist Michel Alouf, who worked in Baalbek in the early 20th century, noted that local residents had for centuries called the platform the work of jinns and believed that humans were incapable of such a feat. Textbooks explain Baalbek with patience and slave labor, but no experiment has yet reproduced the movement of a block of such weight to such a height using ancient technologies. There is no room for mysticism here. There is room for one honest admission. We do not know exactly how it was done. The last point of our journey is in Ethiopia, and it is perhaps the most mysterious of all. Lalibela was a small town in the north of the country that houses 11 monolithic churches carved from solid rock in the 12th to 13th centuries. These churches were not built, but carved. The builders began by selecting a section of rock and carving a deep trench around it, leaving a solid stone block in the middle. Then, from this block, from top to bottom, buildings with walls, windows, columns, and internal halls were carved. The Church of Bet Georgis, dedicated to St. George, is carved in the shape of an equilateral cross and goes 12 meters into the ground. If you stand on the edge of the trench and look down, you see a building with perfectly flat walls carved from volcanic tuff, standing in a rectangular pit like a ship in a dry dock. All 11 churches are connected by underground tunnels and passages, forming a labyrinth in which it is easy to get lost. A drainage system diverts rainwater from the walls, preventing it from eroding the stone. The orientation of the buildings takes into account the cardinal directions and the directions of water flows. According to Ethiopian tradition, King Lalibela ordered the construction of a New Jerusalem after Muslims captured the real Jerusalem in 1187. Legend has it that the construction took 23 years, and that angels helped the workers at night, completing double their quota. If you discard the angels and calculate the volume of rock that had to be extracted, the numbers are daunting. For Bet Georgis alone, about 500 cubic meters of rock had to be removed. For all 11 churches with tunnels and trenches, the count runs into tens of thousands of cubic meters, without steel tools, without explosives, without mechanization. The Portuguese monk Francisco Alvarez, who reached Lalibela in 1521, wrote in his notes that no one would believe him when he told them what he had seen. He was right. In Europe, his report was considered a fabrication, and Lalibela remained virtually unknown to the Western world for another 400 years. Even today, when the temples are listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, most people outside of Africa have never heard of them. Bet Georgis stands in its stone pit today, and rain drains down its walls exactly as intended 800 years ago. Every Sunday, priests in white robes descend the narrow steps carved into the rock and hold services in the same halls for which these churches were created. Lalibela did not become a museum, it remained a living temple, and this may be the greatest miracle. We have gone through 7 points on the map, separated by thousands of kilometers and millennia. Roman concrete, Minoan plumbing, Egyptian integration into the landscape, Nabatean rock carving, Indian geometry of depth, Lebanese logistics of the impossible, and Ethiopian subtractive construction. None of these technologies were passed on to the next civilization. Each time knowledge was born, reached perfection, and died with the culture that gave birth to it. The recipe for Roman concrete was lost after the fall of the empire and has not been fully recovered to this day. Minoan hydraulics disappeared with the volcanic eruption on Santorini. Nabatean rock carving mastery ended when trade routes shifted and Petra became deserted. We tend to think that progress is a straight line, from simple to complex, from caves to skyscrapers. These 7 places prove that the line of progress has always been broken, with peaks that we still cannot replicate, and valleys that lasted for centuries. Perhaps the main mistake of textbooks is not that they lie, but that they depict a smooth road where there was actually a mountain path with precipices. And if knowledge truly dies with civilizations, then each of these 7 places is not just a tourist attraction, but a warning. A warning that even the most perfect technology is useless if there is no one to pass it on to the next generation. What year were you born, and from what country are you? Write in the comments. I'm curious where people who watch to the end come from. We don't know what knowledge we will lose tomorrow, and how many centuries it will take to rediscover it. But one thing is certain. Whoever laughs at primitive ancestors today has simply never stood under the dome of the Pantheon and touched the walls of Lalibela